Few organisms on Earth have occupied two entirely opposing realities at the exact same moment in human history. To modern commerce, it is a multi-billion-dollar legal commodity cultivated in sterile, precision-engineered biofacilities. Yet just miles away, the very same botanical structure remains a Schedule I federal felony, the foundational architecture behind decades of mass incarceration and dismantled lives. At its biological core, it produces no venom, sharp spines, or lethal toxins. It produces complex aromatic terpenes and a vast library of lipid-based cannabinoids designed primarily to protect its flowers from ultraviolet radiation. Yet human society has waged a century-long, multi-trillion-dollar global crusade to eradicate it from the earth, building entire legal doctrines, enforcement agencies, and international treaties around its total suppression. No other plant has been systematically classified as both an indispensable ancient medicine and a catastrophic moral hazard capable of tearing civilization apart.
Long before it was contraband, long before it was patented, taxed, or criminalized, it was simply an enduring wild weed that struck an extraordinary alliance with the earliest human migrations. Nomadic horsemen cast its fragrant flowers onto glowing stones beneath heavy felt tents, inhaling the sacred fumes to commune with the dead, soothe chronic pain, and prepare for brutal territorial campaigns. For millennia, human empires were physically hoisted upon its indestructible industrial fibers. It carried fleets across uncharted oceans, clothed working armies, and produced the parchment upon which historical doctrines were penned. Then, in a historical blink of an eye, an alliance of corporate industrialists, yellow journalists, and political enforcers engineered a masterclass in psychological propaganda, rebranding an ancient utility into a foreign menace. This is the story of how a harmless green leaf crossed every ocean, built and threatened world empires, and became the most contested, paradoxically forbidden plant on the face of the earth.
Long before recorded history, cannabis established its first alliance with early human settlements in the fertile river valleys of ancient East Asia, serving as an all-in-one source of food, durable fiber, and medicine. Archaeological remnants from the Yangshao culture reveal cannabis seeds deliberately pressed into clay pottery over 6,000 years ago, a testament to its status as one of humanity's very first cultivated crops. Every part of the harvest had purpose. Long fibrous stalks were dried for cordage and durable garments, while nutrient-rich seeds became a vital dietary staple alongside millet and barley. In the ancient pharmacopoeia attributed to Emperor Shennong, known as the Shennong Benchaojing, the plant, referred to as ma, was systematically categorized among the fundamental natural remedies. Early Chinese physicians combined cannabis extracts with wine and other botanicals to create ma fei san, an early systemic anesthetic that enabled pioneer surgeons like Hua Toa to perform painless surgical procedures.
As ancient nomadic cultures traversed the vast Eurasian steppe, the plant took on profound spiritual significance, used in communal fire rituals to bridge the physical realm with the ancestral spirit world. Carried along mountain passes and ancient river corridors, the plant crossed into the Indian subcontinent, encountering rich subtropical soils that nurtured resin-heavy, psychoactive varieties. In the ancient Sanskrit scriptures of the Atharva Veda, cannabis was celebrated as bhang, one of the 5 sacred plants of the universe, credited with relieving anxiety and bestowing divine insight. In Ayurvedic healing, it was widely prepared as cooling balms, tinctures, and digestive aids, regarded as a potent medicine when utilized with discipline and therapeutic intention. High in the frozen Altai Mountains,
archaeological excavations of Pazouric burial mounds unlocked definitive physical evidence of how deeply ancient Eurasian cultures revered this plant.
Alongside ornate gold talismans and preserved leather bridles lay Scythian bronze braziers, carefully packed for the afterlife with preserved cannabis flowers and seeds. Chemical analysis of these charred seeds verified the historical accounts of Greek historian Herodotus, who documented nomadic tribes purifying themselves with the fragrant vapors of burning hemp. Across mountain trails and desert trading posts, merchants transported the seeds along the Silk Road, carrying an essential botanical resource toward the gates of the Mediterranean world. As trade routes stitched east to west, the plant transformed from a regional utility into an international commodity of medicine, mysticism, and daily commerce. Early scholars and physicians cataloged its physiological effects with clinical neutrality, prescribing it for pain, earaches, and internal inflammation without moral judgment.
In European monasteries, it was cultivated quietly alongside culinary herbs, esteemed by healers like Hildegard von Bingen for treating stomach ailments and joint pain. Beyond medicine, its sheer mechanical tensile strength became indispensable to everyday survival, clothing rural populations and securing basic trade. Its spent fibers were salvaged, mashed, and recycled into the most durable paper known to human history, capable of resisting decay for centuries. When the printing press revolutionized human thought, it was hempen vellum that preserved the earliest printed words, immune to water damage and insect wear. Renaissance herbalists continued to view the plant through an empirical lens, an organic toolbox of resinous relief and structural endurance. Yet for all its widespread European utility, the plant's psychoactive chemistry remained largely dormant in temperate climates, awaiting warmer equatorial soils. In southern and central Africa, where the plant flourished under intense sunlight, it became daga, deeply embedded in community governance, hunting rituals, and endurance. In the Indian subcontinent, it retained its sacred designation as one of the 5 holy plants of the Atharva Veda, honored as a source of liberation and spiritual focus. By the early modern era, European naturalists realized the plant had diverged into distinct varieties, one bred for towering fiber, the other for potent medicinal resin. As world powers prepared to contest the oceans, this single botanical species would become the undisputed engine behind global maritime conquest. Every single warship that took to the seas required miles of hemp rigging and thousands of square yards of woven canvas to survive the unforgiving ocean. Imperial Russia turned its vast, fertile interior into the hemp capital of the world, monopolizing the global supply that foreign navies desperately required. In England, the demand was so existential that the Crown mandated severe financial penalties for farmers who refused to dedicate a portion of their land to the crop. When European settlers set sail for the Americas, cannabis seeds were among the most critical cargo aboard, carried as insurance for the fledgling colonies. By 1619, the Virginia General Assembly enacted strict legal mandates requiring every landowner to grow Indian hemp to ensure the self-sufficiency of the colony. So vital was this resource that hemp was accepted as legal tender across several colonies, used to settle commercial debts and pay annual taxes. Behind the booming colonial agricultural empire lay the grueling reality of forced labor, enslaved workers performing the brutally exhausting task of breaking and retting the crop. America's founding figures, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, actively cultivated and experimented with different strains, recognizing hemp as essential to agrarian independence. Simultaneously, across the Atlantic slave trade routes, African captives preserved their own botanical heritage, secretly carrying the seeds of psychoactive cannabis into South America and the Caribbean.
In these hidden sanctuaries of resistance, the plant found ideal soil and climate, establishing a cultural presence that rooted deeply into the regional folk medicine of Latin America.
Across rural Mexico, the plant integrated seamlessly into traditional healing, used as an everyday topical tincture to soothe the aches of field laborers and alleviate arthritic pain. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, his soldiers discovered hashish as an alternative to scarce wine rations, prompting the emperor to issue the first modern military ban against the plant. Returning French physicians and intellectuals brought the substance back to Paris, founding the infamous Club des Hachishines to explore its psychological and creative dimensions. In 1839, Irish physician William O'Shaughnessy published the first modern clinical validation of cannabis tinctures, demonstrating their powerful efficacy in treating tetanus, rabies, and convulsive disorders. O'Shaughnessy's breakthrough transformed cannabis into a staple of Western medicine, sparking a golden age where tinctures lined the shelves of every pharmacy in Europe and America.
By the late 19th century, cannabis extracts had reached the highest echelons of European society, prescribed by personal physicians to monarchs and aristocrats as an unparalleled analgesic and antispasmodic. In the United States, commercial pharmaceutical laboratories embraced the botanical extract. Major manufacturers like Parke-Davis and Eli Lilly mass-produced standardized cannabis preparations sold openly over the counter. When the British Empire launched the monumental 1883 Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, interviewing over 1,000 doctors and experts, it concluded that moderate use was practically harmless and an outright ban would cause immense social unrest. Across equatorial megaprojects like the Panama Canal, migrant laborers turned to the plant to survive relentless physical trauma, heat exhaustion, and tropical fevers. Subsequent investigations by U.S. Army medical boards in Panama repeatedly affirmed that the plant caused no moral degeneration, no violent outbursts, and posed no threat to military readiness. As political upheaval gripped Mexico during the 1910 revolution, the plant traveled northward with migrating families and soldiers, becoming forever entwined with the legendary folk anthems of the Revolutionary era. When Mexican immigrants arrived in border communities like El Paso, they brought their time-honored remedies with them. But local authorities viewed both the migrants and their unfamiliar name for the plant, marijuana, with deep racial suspicion. In 1915, El Paso enacted the first municipal ban specifically targeting the word marijuana, creating a blueprint for criminalization, driven not by scientific harm, but by racial anxieties over demographic change. As the plant migrated into urban centers like New Orleans, it found a home among black jazz innovators who embraced reefer for its ability to heighten sensory timing and dissolve musical inhibitions. By the early decades of the 20th century, cannabis had completed its global encirclement, rooted as an industrial fiber, an established pharmaceutical remedy, and a vibrant countercultural staple across every populated continent. In the 1930s, the invention of the mechanical decorticator promised an industrial revolution, making hemp processing fast and cheap enough to compete directly with timber and synthetic fibers. Journalists and agronomists heralded hemp as the new billion-dollar crop, predicting it would yield over 25,000 commercial products, from durable paper to renewable plastics. Yet this agricultural promise posed a direct threat to emerging petrochemical monopolies and synthetic giants like DuPont, which had heavily invested in patented petroleum-derived plastics and nylon. Simultaneously, publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst had invested vast fortunes in timberlands and paper milling infrastructure to supply his nationwide newspaper empire with wood pulp newsprint. An annual crop that could produce 4 times more paper per acre than mature trees threatened to upend billions in entrenched capital investments in forestry and processing mills.
In the medical realm, pharmaceutical companies had successfully standardized cannabis tinctures, distributing them across the nation for insomnia, migraines, and chronic pain management.
Yet the rise of synthetic, single-molecule pharmaceutical brands like aspirin, barbiturates, and opiates offered shelf-stable consistency, gradually displacing complex natural plant extracts that varied from crop to crop. Because cannabinoids are fat-soluble lipids that could not be easily formulated for hypodermic injection, modern medicine began shifting toward fast-acting, water-soluble synthetic compounds. Throughout the American Midwest, generations of agricultural communities continued to rely on hemp as a rotation crop that naturally restored nitrogen to exhausted soils without chemical fertilizers. In Europe, countries like Italy perfected specialized retting techniques, producing hemp textiles so remarkably soft and durable they supplied luxury fashion and high-end home goods.
Visionary industrialist Henry Ford went so far as to engineer an experimental automobile built from hemp and soy composite plastics and powered by hemp-derived biofuels, envisioning a completely renewable industrial future. Yet the unstoppable expansion of cheap petroleum, coupled with subsidized fossil fuel infrastructure, swiftly overwhelmed natural biocomposite technologies before they could reach scale. As global naval fleets transitioned completely from wood and canvas to steel armor and coal-powered steam engines, the ancient strategic necessity of naval hemp collapsed virtually overnight. Within a single generation, an agricultural pillar that had sustained world civilizations for over 5,000 years was reduced to an afterthought, vulnerable, marginalized, and ripe for political reinvention. Stripped of its indispensable industrial status and sidelined by synthetic medicine, the plant was left completely defenseless against a new breed of political architects preparing to launch its total prohibition.
Decades of peer-reviewed clinical literature documenting its low toxicity and medical value were quietly shelved, ignored by a political apparatus seeking total control. By deliberately conflating industrial hemp with the exoticized street term marijuana, special interests and print empires laid the groundwork to eliminate an agricultural competitor without public outcry. The American Medical Association's chief legal counsel, Dr. William Woodward, directly challenged the impending bans, arguing that the medical profession was being robbed of an irreplaceable therapeutic agent based on tabloid sensationalism. The material that had secured the greatest fleets in human history was relegated to museum showcases, its centuries of naval dominance erased from standard school textbooks. Across the industrial heartlands of Europe and America, the once thriving natural bast fiber industry went quiet, replaced entirely by synthetic nylon and petroleum-derived threads.
Farmers who had cultivated the crop for generations prepared for their final harvests, oblivious to the fact that their family heritage was about to be classified as criminal contraband. With synthetic patents secured and industrial hemp sidelined, corporate chemical and timber conglomerates entrenched a monopoly over modern materials that would last for the next century. Scientific inquiry into the plant's complex chemical makeup ground to an immediate halt as academic institutions preemptively purged their botanical inventories to avoid regulatory penalties. In losing hemp, modern agriculture lost one of its most potent regenerative rotation crops, accelerating the transition toward intensive, chemical-dependent monoculture farming. The era of fiber, medicine, and maritime empire had ended. In the quiet corridors of Washington, the trap was set, and the plant was about to enter the darkest chapter of its history. At the helm of the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics stood Harry J. Anslinger, a shrewd bureaucratic tactician who recognized that expanding his agency required a brand new domestic enemy. Anslinger assembled the Gore Files, an unscientific anthology of sensational crimes and bizarre behaviors, methodically attributing them to the smoking of marijuana without toxicological evidence. Publishing tycoon William Randolph Hearst weaponized his nationwide newspaper syndicate, flooding American living rooms with lurid yellow journalism stories designed to provoke immediate racial and social panic. Financed by church groups and exploitation filmmakers, propaganda films like Reefer Madness portrayed cannabis not as a botanical herb, but as an instant catalyst for psychosis, manslaughter, and moral ruin. In the spring of 1937, congressional hearings were convened on the proposed Marijuana Tax Act. The committee heard overwhelmingly from Anslinger's bureau, accepting anecdotal horror stories as scientific fact. The American Medical Association fought back. Dr. William Woodward demanded empirical proof, stating that the bureau had failed to produce a single shred of clinical evidence. Yet his testimony was dismissed. Because an outright federal ban was constitutionally questionable at the time, Congress used taxation as a weapon, creating a legal trap where possessing the required tax stamp was impossible without first possessing the forbidden plant. On October 5, 1937, just days after the law took effect, Samuel Caldwell was arrested in Denver for selling 2 marijuana cigarettes, receiving 4 years of hard labor in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Pharmacies across the nation surrendered their inventories rather than risk criminal prosecution, erasing cannabis from official medical formularies and the shelves of American healthcare. Refusing to accept Anslinger's claims blindly, New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia appointed the New York Academy of Medicine to conduct the first exhaustive sociological and clinical study of the drug. Published in 1944, the LaGuardia Report dismantled every pillar of the federal propaganda campaign, concluding that cannabis was not a gateway drug and did not alter basic personality or induce violence. Enraged by the scientific refutation, Anslinger launched a ruthless public campaign to suppress the report, threatening researchers with prosecution and successfully halting independent domestic research for decades. Then, historical irony struck. With the outbreak of World War II and the loss of Asian fiber imports, the United States military faced an existential shortage of industrial hemp for naval rigging, parachute webbing, and fire hoses. In 1942, the federal government released the film Hemp for Victory, reversing its own narrative overnight and pleading with patriotic farmers to plant vast acreage of the very crop it had outlawed 5 years prior. Dozens of state-of-the-art government processing facilities were constructed across the American heartland, producing millions of pounds of essential cordage to support the Allied war effort.
The moment peace was declared, the wartime alliance vanished. The government shut down every processing plant, canceled farmer contracts, and reinstated the total prohibition without hesitation. In 1951, Congress enacted the Boggs Act, establishing mandatory minimum prison sentences for first-time possession, formally treating cannabis with the same punitive severity as heroin. In the paranoid climate of the Cold War, Anslinger rebranded his crusade, falsely claiming that cannabis was an agent of communist subversion aimed at pacifying the American populace. In 1961, the United States successfully exported its prohibitionist model to the entire world through the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, binding signatory nations to criminalize the plant globally. While the political world clamped down, a scientific breakthrough occurred in Israel. In 1964, Dr. Raphael Mechoulam successfully isolated and synthesized THC, unlocking the biological key to how the plant interacts with human physiology.
By the late 1960s, cannabis became the supreme cultural badge of the anti-war movement, embraced by a generation that viewed its prohibition as an emblem of state hypocrisy and militarism. In 1969,
Counterculture figure Timothy Leary dealt a devastating blow to the federal apparatus when the Supreme Court ruled in Leary v. United States that the 1937 Tax Act was unconstitutional, striking down the foundation of federal prohibition. Faced with the collapse of the 1937 Act, President Richard Nixon responded with total escalation, rebuilding the federal enforcement framework from the ground up and formally declaring the war on drugs. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 classified cannabis under Schedule I, the most restrictive category possible, legally asserting that the plant had zero accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. To provide scientific cover for the new law, Nixon appointed the Schaefer Commission, expecting a bipartisan panel of conservative experts to deliver a damning indictment of the plant's dangers. In March 1972, the Schaefer Commission delivered a stunning conclusion. Criminalizing cannabis was far more damaging to society than the drug itself, and personal possession should be decriminalized immediately. Nixon completely discarded the multi-million-dollar report he had commissioned, privately declaring that he would never legalize cannabis and ordering federal agencies to intensify enforcement operations. In July 1973, Nixon established the Drug Enforcement Administration, merging multiple enforcement branches into a unified federal agency equipped with unprecedented budgets and tactical power. Decades later, top Nixon aide John Ehrlichman admitted the political strategy. By getting the public to associate the anti-war left and black communities with cannabis, the administration could criminalize their leaders, raid their homes, and vilify them on the nightly news. The legal trap was complete. Science had been silenced, institutions had been militarized, and the stage was set for a multi-decade global war that would touch millions of human lives. By the 1980s, the enforcement of cannabis prohibition shed all civil pretenses, adopting the tactics, armaments, and psychological doctrine of urban warfare on domestic soil. In the dense mountains of Northern California, the campaign against marijuana planting, Operation Camp, deployed military helicopters and armed task forces to hunt growers deep in public forests. South of the border, the United States funded massive aerial eradication missions, dropping millions of gallons of toxic herbicides like paraquat over Latin American farmlands, devastating local ecosystems. Under the banner of Just Say No, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 introduced severe mandatory minimums, reinstating policies that treated nonviolent plant possession as a direct national security threat. Federal guidelines established strict algebraic equations for incarceration. Cultivating 100 seedlings was legally equated to trafficking 100-kilogram quantities of processed narcotics, triggering mandatory decades behind bars.
Within 2 decades, the United States prison population exploded by over 500%, driven overwhelmingly by low-level, nonviolent drug offenses that filled state and federal penitentiaries to capacity. Though epidemiological data proved that black and white citizens consumed cannabis at virtually identical rates, black Americans were arrested and incarcerated at nearly 4 times the rate of white Americans. Civil asset forfeiture laws created a powerful financial incentive for law enforcement agencies, enabling police to seize private homes, vehicles, and savings accounts based solely on suspected cannabis cultivation. To combat the shift from outdoor fields to indoor operations, law enforcement deployed military thermal imaging helicopters, scanning private suburban rooftops for heat signatures generated by high-intensity grow lamps. In 2001, the Supreme Court drew a constitutional line, ruling that deploying advanced thermal surveillance against a private home without a warrant violated the fundamental protections of the Fourth Amendment. Across the Caribbean Basin and Gulf of Mexico, maritime task forces waged high-stakes interdiction campaigns, seizing millions of pounds of imported compressed brick cannabis on the open seas. Prohibition did not stop cultivation. It simply forced it indoors, driving underground horticulturists to engineer hyper-controlled microclimates and pioneer potent hydroponic growing techniques. By meticulously eliminating male plants to prevent pollination, growers perfected sinsemilla, seedless cannabis, dramatically increasing cannabinoid concentrations and fundamentally changing the plant's biological potency. While America escalated its punitive crusade, the Netherlands adopted the policy of gedoogbeleid, pragmatic tolerance, separating soft and hard drug markets and proving that regulation did not trigger societal collapse. In underground genetics vaults across Amsterdam and the Pacific Northwest, dedicated breeders created legendary hybrid strains, crossbreeding resilient Afghan indicas with towering equatorial sativas. In Mexico, Prohibition created staggering profit margins that fueled the rise of powerful, organized cartels, transforming fragmented smuggling networks into multi-billion-dollar transnational syndicates. The 1985 torture and murder of DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena shocked the United States government, unleashing an unprecedented wave of diplomatic pressure, border lockdowns, and aggressive cross-border operations. The border became an armed, militarized zone, equipped with military sensors, National Guard units, and multi-layered physical barriers designed to stem the relentless flow of illicit contraband. In thousands of schools nationwide, the DARE program systematically educated an entire generation of children to view cannabis through the lens of absolute criminality and moral peril. Beyond the criminal justice system, the collateral consequences of prohibition tore families apart, triggering automatic evictions from public housing, loss of financial aid, and child protective service seizures.
Yet, in the darkest depths of the 1980s AIDS epidemic, a quiet underground rebellion took root in San Francisco, where activists discovered that cannabis was the only remedy that restored appetite and provided solace. In 1988, science delivered a profound discovery. Dr. Alan Howlett located the CB1 receptor in the human brain, establishing that the human nervous system is biologically wired to respond to cannabinoids. 4 years later, Meshulam's team discovered anandamide, proving that the human body naturally produces its own internal cannabinoids to regulate mood, sleep, appetite, and immune response. Between 1970 and 2000, over 20 million arrests were carried out in the United States alone, a monumental societal expenditure that failed to reduce availability or eradicate the plant. After decades of unchecked enforcement, the moral and legal foundation of the war on drugs began to crumble under the combined weight of scientific truth, human suffering, and grassroots defiance.
In the heart of San Francisco, the modern legalization movement was born not out of corporate ambition, but out of raw human empathy, providing botanical relief to those abandoned by standard medicine. In November 1996, California voters defied federal authority by passing Proposition 215, igniting a state-level rebellion that recognized medical necessity over federal prohibition. For the first time in 60 years, dispensaries opened their doors under state law, replacing back-alley transactions with clean, verified, and community-rooted medical access. Yet Washington refused to yield. Federal authorities raided state legal cooperatives, threatened physicians with license revocations, and insisted that state referendums could not override federal drug classifications. In 2002, federal courts delivered a crucial shield for patients, ruling that government attempts to silence physicians violated the First Amendment, securing a doctor's legal right to recommend the botanical remedy.
Simultaneously, scientists brought non-intoxicating cannabidiol, CBD, to global prominence, documenting dramatic reductions in catastrophic pediatric epileptic seizures resistant to all traditional pharmaceutical drugs. The story of young Charlotte Fiji and the strain named in her honor shattered decades of moral panic overnight, transforming the debate from a countercultural clash into an urgent human rights imperative for families.
When mainstream medical authorities publicly reversed their positions on national television, admitting the scientific community had been systematically misled, public opinion shifted irrevocably toward legalization. In November 2012, Colorado and Washington dismantled 80 years of global precedent, becoming the first territories on Earth to legally regulate cannabis like alcohol for all adult citizens. In 2013, the federal government issued the Cole Memorandum, a tactical truce that allowed state-level legal markets to flourish without the immediate threat of federal military raids.
That same year, Uruguay made world history by becoming the first sovereign nation to legalize and regulate cannabis at the federal level, framing the policy as an essential public health and anti-cartel strategy. In 2018, Canada became the first major global economy and G7 nation to legalize adult-use cannabis coast to coast, establishing a comprehensive industrial, medical, and commercial regulatory framework. 81 years after the 1937 Tax Act outlawed the crop, the 2018 Farm Bill restored industrial hemp to legal agricultural status across the United States, resurrecting an ancient agricultural industry. From Germany to South Africa, from Malta to Thailand, the international treaty framework constructed in 1961 began to fracture as nations around the world reclaimed their sovereign right to regulate the plant. In December 2020, the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs officially recognized the plant's medical value, voting to remove cannabis from the world's most restrictive drug treaty schedule 59 years after placing it there.
What began as an outlaw counterculture has rapidly transformed into a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire, traded on international stock exchanges and backed by venture capital conglomerates. Modern dispensaries mirror high-end cosmetic boutiques, packaging the ancient plant in sleek, child-proof cases, vaporizers, and gourmet confections tailored for mainstream consumer lifestyles. Yet this modern commercial boom exists alongside a profound moral contradiction. Thousands remain locked inside prison cells for selling the very flower that corporate executives now market for massive fortunes. Social equity advocates and legal clinics fight to rectify the generational harm of the drug war, demanding automatic record expungement and equitable access to commercial licenses for impacted communities. Science has moved far beyond simple THC percentages, uncovering the entourage effect, where hundreds of minor cannabinoids, flavonoids, and aromatic terpenes work synergistically to provide targeted therapy.
Beyond medicine and intoxication, industrial hemp is reclaiming its ancient structural heritage, serving as a carbon-negative building material, a sustainable alternative to plastics, and a durable biocomposite for green architecture. Where full botanical access remains restricted, dangerous, unregulated synthetic chemicals emerge to fill the void, demonstrating the severe public health hazards of continued prohibition. In the United States, federal health agencies formally recognized what physicians knew for millennia, confirming that cannabis possesses accepted medical value, dismantling the Schedule I classification. Yet, as commercial industrialization sweeps the market, traditional legacy growers who preserved the plant's genetic heritage through decades of persecution fight to survive corporate consolidation and heavy regulatory taxation. Today, cannabis occupies a complex transitional crossroads, celebrated as a multi-billion-dollar therapeutic miracle, yet still entangled in the historical, legal, and cultural contradictions of the past century.
Through millennia of human empires, across continent-spanning wars, and through an unprecedented century of state-sponsored eradication, this resilient botanical species refused to be erased. Our relationship with this plant is not a modern aberration, but an ancient evolutionary partnership etched into our very physiology through the universal architecture of the endocannabinoid system.
In every era, cannabis has served as a mirror to human society, reflecting our capacity for agricultural genius, our institutional fears, our racial and economic prejudices, and our scientific curiosity. The century of prohibition extracted an immeasurable human toll. Millions of lives disrupted, families separated, and scientific discoveries delayed by fear, prejudice, and political expediency. Today, the plant is returning to its rightful place in the soil, re-emerging as an indispensable agricultural ally, capable of restoring depleted farmlands and providing renewable materials for a sustainable future.
In modern medicine, it has regained its ancient standing, not as a panacea, but as a legitimate, rigorously validated therapeutic tool that brings comfort and relief to millions of suffering patients. The history of cannabis teaches a timeless truth that science, compassion, and empirical reality will ultimately outlast even the most entrenched political crusades and legal dogmas. Where it was once demonized as the devil's harvest and an assassin of youth, it is now recognized simply for what it has always been: a versatile, resilient botanical companion to human civilization. It was never a moral hazard, nor a demonic poison. It is simply an enduring leaf of the earth, one that shaped our past, challenged our institutions, and will help build our future. The forbidden leaf has finally stepped out from the shadows of prohibition, reclaiming its rightful place in the great, unbroken tapestry of human history.